Hello, Cody. This is going to be a kind of a walkthrough demonstration on some alternative processes for exercises 9 and 10. So here for this, we're going to be bringing this into Procreate, and we're going to be building a file that has three different layers. We're going to have a background color, our reference image in the middle here, and then on top, we're going to have our reduction layer. So our reference image from the image bank that we have, probably about 10 to 15 images to choose from. They're all black and white images that are pretty easy to identify value ranges on. And then we have our reduction layer at the top. So what this reduction layer represents is essentially like whenever we're doing our reductive charcoal drawing, we basically have this top layer of charcoal that we erase down from. So for that reason, we're going to be having this reduction layer on top, and we're going to be setting it to multiply so that we can see our reference image that's underneath it. The reason the background color is pink on this is that because whenever we're working with reductive process in charcoal and we erase through the charcoal, a lot of times our paper is still left as kind of like a gray. It never really kind of gets back to that clean white. So the reason I have that background color set to pink is because I'm kind of trying to mimic the tinting of the paper, and we're going to come back in and add in our clean white afterwards. So what we want to do now is try to look at our reference image and try to identify moments in our reference image where we have the strongest amounts of light in our composition. And for this reductive process, we're going to be using the eraser with the, I'm trying to use this artist crayon brush to create a little bit more of an erased texture, and not like a full 100% erase, but something that leaves behind a little bit of information to start to render this image. So the rendering for this reductive process is going to be 100% done with the eraser. Unlike the additive process where we're trying to build values up and create dark values, here in the reductive process, we're actually trying to bring out the highlights first and use the highlights to establish, again, the bright areas in our composition, and then whatever's left behind is going to be what is going to be our essentially our middle values, right? So our brightest highlight is going to be here on this cube, the top side of the cube, as well as the top right side of our sphere, as well as the top right side of this vase. So if we had to guess, we can probably say that our light source is coming up from the top right. So now that we've identified our three major areas of highlight, we're going to go ahead and start to reduct, turning on our reduction layer and getting out our eraser here. We're going to start chiseling out some of these highlights. So as we start to reduct these highlights, we also want to be mindful of the placement of our shadows. Make sure that as you're erasing your highlights, you do pay attention to the edge quality as well as the placement of our shadows. We do want to be mindful of the information that we do leave behind because, like I said before, whatever doesn't get erased at this part of the rendering is going to be what develops into our middle tones, right? Our middle values in this composition. So here we're just knocking out this top portion of the cube. Again, being mindful of that kind of shadow edge, as well as the drop shadow of the sphere on the top of the cube. And then here we're gonna kind of get that density going a little bit more and make sure that we're translating the brightness of that face before we cascade over to that front face of the cube. Okay, and this is a little bit time consuming, so here in a moment I'm going to keep on working on this for a bit, and then we're going to fast forward real quick so that when we can kind of see what the rendering starts to look like as we start to activate the highlights on the rest of our forms. Here we're getting into the highlights on our sphere. On the sphere, it's a very kind of peculiar type of highlight that we're starting to render because we do have a lot of what we call raking light on the surface of our sphere, rounded surfaces. The light does diffuse differently than it does on hard surfaces like the cube or even the vase. The vase and the cube have these kind of flat faces where the light kind of breaks over edges, and we have sharp highlights and sharp shadows. But on the sphere, we have a situation where the light really does kind of diffuse and fall into shadow in a very kind of soft way. So again, paying attention to edge quality when it comes to highlights as well as shadows is very important here, and trying to render these objects in a way that they kind of stand out from one another and have these kind of unique lighting situations going on. So as we kind of start to have our diffuse light meet these shadows, we do want that information to get a little bit softer, even if that means kind of taking the opacity down a little bit, so that our eraser doesn't quite take out as much information as it is when the opacity is set on high. So here coming into our vase, again, the top edge of our vase is a lot brighter than the body of the vase because it is receiving more of that light. It is facing the light source. So the top face of the vase is going to be quite a bit brighter than the body. And here again, this diffused light is kind of giving us some soft shadows, so we just need to be mindful of the edges of these soft shadows as we render. And then another thing to kind of keep in mind here is that in looking at our reference image, the objects themselves look like they're a little bit darker than the surface that they're sitting on. So whenever we're rendering the surface that our objects are sitting on, I think it's going to be important for us to really translate the brightness of that surface so that we can kind of show that that plane is catching more light. And once we start to really translate the brightness of that tabletop, then our objects are going to be again separated not only from each other, but then also from the surface that they're sitting on. They're going to be seen as kind of occupying a very kind of distinct space. So here I'm kind of adding a little bit more pressure and breaking down more of that tabletop and erasing out more information and leaving less of that texture behind, so we have a brighter looking tabletop. And then here coming up to this edge, in the reference photo there isn't really like a clear edge or a clear break where our tabletop is and where our background begins. So we kind of have to be really mindful of these value transitions. So here I'm still missing that back left corner of the tabletop, but we'll drop that in here in a moment. So um, again, let's take a look at our reference image. And in looking at a reference image, it looks like our objects are just a tiny bit darker than the background. So I think it'll be a smart move to go ahead and start to chisel out the rest of that tabletop and then come back in and try to figure out a way in which we can render that background so that our objects come forward and that our background kind of gets sent back without having to kind of mix with our foreground, or getting into a situation where, like here in the sphere and the background, where our values are so similar that they kind of blend into one another. So just kind of be wary of that there is going to be moments where objects can fall into our background, but for this we do want to maintain that distinction between objects, background, foreground, and then even the distinction between objects themselves. So here we're going to start working on the tabletop as well as the background, and we'll go ahead and jump and fast forward here in a moment, and then take a look at what the finished product looks like. Okay, so this is what our exercise 9 should look like at this point. Obviously, the drawing isn't 100% rendered yet, but we're at a stopping point where we've reducted as much information as we could. We've rendered highlights, and at the same time, we've also rendered some of these middle values that we can see anywhere that kind of base red is still left behind. So now what we can do is save our current progress and submit this for exercise 9. You can also take a screenshot of your current progress before moving on to exercise 10, and we'll go ahead and do that now. All right, so if you recall, exercise 10 is going to be the additive charcoal portion of this exercise, where we kind of go back in and drop in shadows that are darker than our middle values, as well as any kind of near black and black values. And to finish off the drawing, we're going to be using our white brush to come back in here and drop in our true highlights to really kind of get our full value range. So let's go ahead and turn on our reference image again and see if we can identify some of these darker shadows are. Again, we've already rendered our middle grays because of the red that we have in our background. Now we need to identify where our darker shadows are. At the moment, the ones that we can very easily and readily identify are the shadows of the sphere that are dropping into the top side of our cube here, which is what we call a compound shadow, where we have a shadow sitting on top of a shadow to create an even darker shadow. So we have one on the cube as well as the top left portion of the vase. We also see this in our drop shadows at the base of the cube, as well as the base of the vase. So these are going to be shadows that are darker than the middle tones that we've established. And we also have these kind of transitional shadows that exist between the area where the cube and the vase kind of look like they're touching. We have a shadow that kind of starts to kind of materialize there. And then we also have a shadow on the left side of our cube where our cube kind of moves further and further away from the light. It's kind of a small triangular shadow that leads into the drop shadow. If we zoom in to the very bottom of our cube, we can kind of start to see where these near black shadows are. These really near black shadows are what really seats our objects in these compositions. So they really ground everything and they really, again, fill up our value range. So that's where if we're looking at our value scale, that would be our black on the value scale. So let's go ahead and render these darker grays as well as our near blacks, and then we'll finish off with the true white for our highlight. So here I'm making another layer for my shadows. You don't have to do this. You can still work on the reduction layer, but this is just going to be so that at the end we can see what developed for exercise 9, and then we'll develop for exercise 10. So these shadows are going to help us one more time, help bring our objects forward, start to define a little bit of this edge quality, and really start to give our objects a truer sense of form. Here we're playing with opacity a little bit so that we can see the values a little bit easier. That's the layer opacity. And again, on the sphere, the shadows are a little bit softer. They're not super hard edged. It is a raking light. So just be aware of edge quality whenever you're rendering your shadows. And here underneath the sphere, where the sphere kind of sits in on this face, we have kind of like what we had at the bottom of our forms is this kind of compound shadow that starts off as this really dark red. And then as we get to this kind of meeting point, we have like a near black. And then here we can really kind of tighten up the size of our brush and make that a little bit smaller so that we can get some of these really tight, sharp shadows. And if we need to switch into a more solid, less textured brush, that can also definitely help the process out. Here, this kind of like darker gray shadow is going to help create a little bit more spatial relationship between our vase and our cube. And it's also going to give us a little bit more edge definition for our vase. So we have that nice sharp edge developing here. Okay, and then here, once we wrap up this this drop shadow, we can turn off our reference image and see how the drawing is progressing. Okay, and here, like I said, we're just gonna sharpen up our brush, get that a little bit smaller so we can get some of these sharper bottom edges. But as we can see here, all these transitional shadows are helping break our objects apart from one another, develop our value range, and then also sharpen up our edge quality. And as we move back into our reference image, we're going to try to track a few more of these transitional shadows, and then we can move on to dropping in our clean white highlights. And sometimes whenever we're trying to make some of these middle values look a little bit darker, instead of coming back in with a darker brush, a lot of times the contrast that we create with that clean white is going to help those middle grays look like they're darker than they actually are, just from having a brighter white value. So we'll see what that looks like here in a moment. Right now, the white that we are seeing is because we have the reference image underneath our reduction layer. So the white that you're seeing is going to be kind of like that light pink that we had at the beginning. So that bright white will have to get kicked back up whenever we're just in the the reduction layers. Okay, so now that we've gone in and rendered a lot of these darker shadows, really deep black shadows, now we're ready to finish this drawing off with the clean white. As you can see, dropping in these darker shadows really kind of makes that light pink almost kind of look like a clean white. But once we drop in the white on the top of these really bright highlights, we'll start to see the value range really kind of come together, and then have these objects start to come forward even more. So we're going to make sure that we have our reference layer turned off, and we're going to be focusing now in on our highlights. And just like we have um, shadows within shadows, we have highlights within highlights. The brightest of our highlights are going to be where the light's striking the hardest. And then as our light diffuses over the surface, the value does start to shift, right? So our clean white's going to be the brightest part of the highlight. And then that pink is going to represent essentially where the light is starting to diffuse over the surface. And like we said before, this bright white is where we can have an opportunity to really kind of sharpen up our edge quality. So anywhere where you can kind of identify a sharp, bright highlight. Again, if you need to switch to a finer brush or a smaller brush to render those sharp edges, that's really what's going to help break these images out from the background as well as the surface that they're sitting on. All right, and that's they're going to be the completed drawing for exercise 10. So we started off with a reducted drawing at the end of exercise 9, and now we've gone through the process of using additive charcoal techniques to refine our edge quality as well as fill out the remainder of the value range. So this is what approximately your drawing should look like at the end. Let me know how this worked out for you, and I look forward to seeing what your drawing looks like.